Welcome, welcome, welcome. Today is Monday, November 4th, 2024. My name is Jay Rosenthal. I'm the co-founder of Cultivated Media and the host of this program, which is called Cultivated Live. And since we launched Cultivated almost exactly a year ago, our goal has been to be Canada's industry first, providing you with the most important, insightful, useful, and timely information. We do that through our daily newsletter at Cultivated Daily. We do that through this daily live stream, which is Cultivated Live. So please follow us on LinkedIn, subscribe to us on YouTube, and be sure to get our newsletter in your inbox every single day by going to cultivated.news. I usually am the host and asking the questions on this program, but today I'm going to hand it over to my co-founder and our editor-in-chief, Jeremy Burke, because he is in conversation with Axel Bernabe, who is the health and cannabis partner at Manatt, which is a national law and professional services firm. But before that, he was the inaugural chief of staff and senior policy director of the Office of Cannabis Management in New York. That's how most of you probably know him. So I'm going to hand it over to Jeremy and Axel. So Jeremy and Axel, over to you.
All right, thanks, Jay. So Axel, why don't we start off with talking a little bit about your interesting background. You've had a long career in public service, working for the governor, as well as the Office of Cannabis Management. So tell us a little bit about how you got your start and where you are today.
Sure, Jeremy, happy to do that. Thanks for having me on. I'm a big fan of your reporting in Jay's podcast.
Thanks.
So it's a pleasure to be on and talking about these issues. Without belaboring it, I mean, my background is I'm an attorney by training. I'm a closet economist. That's what my whole family is a long list of economists. So I love economics more than anything. I was in private practice at a law firm. I was a partner at a law firm when I was asked to join the Cuomo administration. This was way back ago. And I told my wife I'd be there for 3 years. And then 8 years later, I finally left. But it was a really, really amazing journey. Anybody who's considering public service, I highly recommend it. Super rewarding. So I was health counsel, so that's what I was responsible for. And one of the small files that I had was medical marijuana, as it was known at the time. So the medical marijuana program. That's where I really cut my teeth and got the hook. Everybody's got their cannabis story. That was mine. I got hooked onto that, and because I became the sort of resident expert, I was asked to do the cannabinoid hemp when the Farm Bill legalized that. To do that, and then finally the governor said, "Well, you're the cannabis guy. Can you draft the law for adult use?" And that's where we worked with very closely with the legislature. That's where Chris Alexander, the first the inaugural executive director of the OCM, was at the Senate at that time. So we back and forth the bill. I significantly reworked it from what the legislature had originally created, and we sort of drafted that, negotiated it out. Took a little while. There were some people that weren't too keen on legalizing, and so, but we got it over the finish line. And then the new governor asked if I would join the OCM and standing up the OCM with Chris. And so I did that for 2.5 years, about, I guess, and just left about a year ago. My job there was at the OCM was to sort of stand up the office and hire folks. We hired 180 people, draft all the regulations, supervise the teams on that. So it was really an incredible experience, and just super rewarding, super complicated. It was really, really difficult. Cannabis is a lot more difficult to regulate and to work in than most people assume. But that's kind of how I got here. So I got pulled into cannabis. Never thought I'd be a cannabis guy, but
yeah, it is endlessly fascinating and endlessly complex. And I hope readers of our newsletter and listeners of this show will, very much understand that. So the reason why we're talking today is a new report from Whitney Econ. The biggest headline number that I think would attract people is that New York is predicted to be a $6 billion market, and sooner than people think, I think in the next 2 years. So Axel, could you walk us through a little bit about maybe the headline numbers of the report, as well as some of the nuances in here that I think, maybe people aren't seeing right off the headline?
Yeah, so maybe it's because I was a regulator for so long, but I'm going to be a bit of a buzzkill right out of the gate. So,
sure.
The report, the press release that went with the report cited the $6 billion number within 2 years. I think that was a typo, because the report itself, especially in the first few pages, actually has a chart which shows the ramp up of the size of the market over the next several years. It is a total addressable market of $6 billion, and that's actually, I think, fairly conservative. And even Bo Whitney says that doesn't include tourism, which he puts at 500 million to 750, but it's probably significantly larger than that. But I think it's going to take a few years to get there. I think Bo's conservative. Next year he puts it at 1.3. Headset puts it, I think, at 2.5. I'm kind of in between those two numbers, but just the headline of 6 billion within 2 years is, I think, ambitious. But you never know. 2.5 next year, 3 or 4 the year after, we might be getting to 6 sooner than we think. So that's the only qualifier on the top headline, Jeremy. But otherwise, the report is interesting. The genesis for the report was that we spent a lot of time when we were in the OCM thinking about how to ramp up the number of licenses. We never like to talk about caps, because regulating total numbers or regulating prices as a government is notoriously difficult. You just don't want to get into that level of economic control or detail. But we did understand, and we were warned by a lot of the other markets that we'd explored and spoken to, that if you ramp up too quickly your licenses on the supply side or on retail, you're going to crash prices, and you're going to lead to a lot of bankruptcies and a lot of roll-ups and turnover. Since we were starting with so many social equity applicants, we wanted to make sure that they were sustainable. So we started that conversation early on. And since it took so long to get some of these dispensaries up and running, we didn't really have to finish the conversation. And so I think there were a lot of questions I heard when the November licenses got cleared to be issued, about what data there was on total number of licenses, total market, profitability per license. There wasn't a lot of data out there. So I think Bo was tasked with putting that report together to provide that data so everybody could have an informed conversation.
In terms of maximizing the market, what are the specific things in your view that need to be done to actually serve the market in the most efficient way possible? Does that involve increasing the number of licenses? Or I think the report addressed, the issue with time to market, meaning the issue with once you get your license awarded, how quickly you can actually open your doors. What are some of these issues that still need to be worked through in New York, in your view? And since you've been at the OCM, have you seen it accelerate or not?
Yeah, those are great questions, Jeremy. I mean, difficult. I think I call them levers or dials, depending. When we'd have these conversations, some of the best times we're sitting there and brainstorming with the whole team on, what we could realistically expect, what the cost was, what the size of a micro should be, how quickly you could get to market. Mm-hmm. So I think some of the criteria that we need to be looking at is certainly the time it takes for a dispensary to get to market. I think pricing, especially on the cultivation side, is important, because right now it's still relatively high, and most retailers keystone that price, so their margins are sufficient to cover, especially with 280E, which is a real drag on profits. So they need to keystone to keep a certain margin before tax. So I think keeping an eye on prices and keeping an eye on supply is super important. Obviously, the illicit market, the news we got yesterday or the day before was not very promising, where these constitutional challenges brought to due process, with respect to due process on shutting down the illegal stores. I think the health emergency related to this is really an overpowering and strong argument to keep doing that. But looking at how many illegal stores there are is important in deciding sort of how quickly to issue licenses or where to issue them. Then, of course, the question of proximity. There's the whole, the waiver for proximity protection. Proximity protection was a tool we implemented, 1,000 feet between dispensaries, or 2,000, depending on the size of the city. And that was really designed not as a sort of end-all be-all. We were hoping it was going to fade over time, or its importance and relevance would fade over time. But out of the get-go, we'd seen in other jurisdictions and been told about clustering, green zones, where you'd have a lot of infighting between retail dispensaries located next to each other, where there would be huge price wars, where people would be attracting customers and grabbing market shares, and the deepest pockets would always survive. So spreading folks out And I think, originally people pushed back and said, geographically, there's not enough room, too many schools and churches, 1,000-foot rule is going to kill it. But from a real estate perspective, if you look at the map, the proximity protection map, which has over 1,000 locations, there's a really great spread right now in Manhattan. It actually looks really, really good. And I think there's still room available. So I would not be in a hurry to waive that 1,000-foot protection. But that's another one of these criteria. How quickly do you waive? How much do you waive? How do you do it on a case-by-case basis? Another smaller issue, too, is discounting. So the PLMA, the Packaging, Labeling, Marketing, and Advertising regulations, were recently issued by the OCM, where they recommended very broad discretion by retail stores to issue discounts, market discounts, right? It's all about advertising those discounts. I would be cautious there, or I think it's a conversation we need to have. A lot of people submitted comments. I think you want to have discounts sort of more directed to loyalty programs or paid programs where people are being retained as customers, rather than, again, a pricing war where you're putting a sandwich board out that says, buy one, get one free, 60% off, and you have this race to the bottom on pricing. We do have to remember 280E is a real issue. We have to look at states like Michigan, where retail stores are just going out of business. And so I think the timing and speed, there's room, right now there are 824 that have been licensed. There's probably another 500 that are coming through the pipeline from the November queue at least. So you're going to have critical mass. I think now the question is, how many more do you need before you take a breather and say, okay, let's see where these open, let's see how they're doing, let's see how many illegals there are, and so on and so forth. So those are the criteria I think we should be discussing.
Yeah, so there's a lot of meat in there, and I want to turn quickly to, before we get into enforcement and all the kind of thorny issues there, I want to turn quickly to another one of the sort of top line numbers in the report is that New York could potentially sustain 1,600 to 1,700 retail stores. I think the current numbers right now, 222, I believe the OCM put out. And we also heard the interim executive director, Felicia Reed of the OCM, discuss the 1,600 number in a podcast last week. So, Axel, in your view, how are you benchmarking this to other states? Is there a sort of specific population density per dispensary that you were looking at the OCM? And how do you think about that? And how does that factor into all the stuff like price controls and the market size and things like that?
Now we're really getting in deep, and I love this stuff. So, but just a kind of disclaimer and warning for listeners and viewers that we're going to walk out on this. But different states have really done it differently. When we went around and did our kind of tour, we had Washington State that came out of the gate and said, "Look, we're having a two-tier market, which is similar to New York." Mm-hmm. And they put their cannabis regulation in their alcohol bev control center. So they had their liquor regulators also do cannabis. And they said, we have 500 or so, 520 liquor stores in the state. That's how many dispensaries we're going to have done. And, and so they pegged it at that. It's been interesting. They have a very small, you can only own one. Very sustainable market. Everybody's moderately profitable. Nobody's making, a ton of money. So that worked and stabilized. Others, like Illinois, started by grandfathering in the medical providers that came in, and then the social equity licenses got tied up in litigation, and so you still have a fairly limited licensed market in Illinois. Because of sort of litigation and necessity. So the prices, haven't collapsed. The retailers haven't been driven out of business. Conversely, on the opposite pole, of course, you have Oklahoma, which of course we know how that story ended, and Michigan, which we can see. Maryland started with fewer dispensaries and is now, everybody's moving towards lotteries. I don't think specifically, to your question, I don't think anybody has nailed whether it's 15,000, one dispensary per 15 or 20,000. I think I'm not a fan of trying to, as an antitrust lawyer, I'm a fan about, road sort of guideposts and road signs much more than actually setting prices and dictating. So exact numbers. I think you need to just have data and metrics that you're measuring as you go along. So you let them come out, you keep looking at their profitability, you look at the illicit market, you keep the waiver, intact, and then you measure, and you sort of keep adjusting. But 15, 20,000 is probably not a crazy number when you're looking at 280E still being in place and your margins being squeezed that way.
Right. I want to talk about enforcement. You mentioned that there was a recent court ruling that basically said, I mean, I'm not an attorney, so I'm going to paraphrase it as easily as possible, that basically said Mayor Eric Adams, New York City Mayor Eric Adams' Operation Padlock to Protect is violating store owners' due process in terms of putting the padlock on the shop and telling them to be shut if there's illicit cannabis found. What does this mean for enforcement of illicit stores in New York going forward? I mean, I assume that the mayor's office is going to appeal and this will get tied up in the courts. But, from an outside perspective, that's a bit of a blow when, these legal retailers really are fighting to compete with illicit sellers.
Yeah. So I've been really busy recently, so I can't say that I've read all the enforcement decisions. So I'm going to, disclaim that I haven't sunk deeply into this. That's the benefit of not being a regulator anymore.
Sure.
But first, I think the most recent decision is actually, if I were to interpret it favorably for the city, which I think we should, I would say it's a bit more limited. I think what the judge was particularly upset about was that the New York City's own administrative procedures were violated, where they're only supposed to inspect these locations when they're open, and they went into this particular location after the location was closed. And so that was a sort of low-hanging fruit where you could say, look, that wasn't appropriate. I know that the person that you interviewed said clearly, when we are open, we sell illegal THC products effectively, but you weren't allowed to inspect and close them down when they were closed. So technical foul. There was an earlier case over the summer where I think the constitutionality of the due process issue, they didn't have their day in court before you shut them down, was more front and center. I think there's going to have to be some tweaking involved. But look, I think Mayor Adams and Governor Hochul are both effective in getting the job done when they're focused on what they're looking to do. And I think everybody agrees, there's just universal agreement that these folks are taking advantage of a momentary transition from a criminal system to an administrative system which has fines and penalties. So we switched the system, but it's a big tanker that takes a while to pivot. So traditionally, the NYPD would have been able to come in because it would have been a criminal offense, and they would have been able to bust it, no problem. We then moved to an administrative offense because we didn't want to lock people up like we did traditionally. And it's not your legacy operators that came in, right? Your former dealers that were distributing that opened these pop-ups. It's another illicit group that's been doing it in all these other states. It's organized, and they know exactly what they're doing, and they're violating, every administrative law we put in place. It's just that because there's so many at the same time, giving everybody that hearing makes it really difficult to get critical mass to shut down thousands of stores. So I just don't like the technical side of it and how they're abusing and they're crying wolf about, having their due process violated when it's patently clear that they're not allowed to sell these products. They know it, their employees know it, the city knows it, the judge knows it. And it's because we did the right thing and took it out of the criminal law that it makes it harder to do. So it frustrates me. But I don't see this relenting. I don't see the city and the state of New York being in any way, shy about changing the laws to expedite administrative hearings or processes to keep shutting these guys down. It's too important a job to do.
On the optics or maybe even public relations side of that question, and this is sort of a personal question for you, Axel, how do you balance the core idea of the MRTA, the Marijuana Regulation and Taxation Act, that was specifically set to give people harmed by the war on drugs opportunities with this sort of enforcement mechanism, right? Because I think, anybody who's running a legal cannabis business would say it's unfair that we have to compete with people who aren't paying taxes, aren't complying with the laws, right? But there is a very large and vocal group of people who say that this is sort of recriminalizing cannabis by a different dimension. So how do you kind of balance those questions and those optics, both from your perspective as a former regulator, now as an attorney working in the space?
No, this is another one of those, these were usually late night issues over beer where we would all pontificate on, did we go too far in how much we decriminalized, the amount we decriminalized, the sale, the jury for me, look, decriminalizing in the way criminalization was being used was unequivocally an excuse to lock up, and we know who was being locked up.
Sure.
But I'm going to answer it as an economist, because this is a slightly controversial position to take. And, I know some of my former colleagues, disagree with me on this. But I don't think it's intention, this sort of, it's more of an administrative, it's not recriminalizing, but pushing people hard on closing down stores. From an economic standpoint, the reason it's not the same is the following. We never said that legalizing cannabis or decriminalizing cannabis was supposed to mean that everybody could engage in the sale of cannabis. We wanted to move it from a criminal program to a health driven program, right? There is such a thing as cannabis use disorder. We want to make sure people don't overconsume. We want to keep it regulated. We want stores to be limited. We don't want crazy low prices, right? We want to do this in a regulated manner like alcohol. So alcohol doesn't allow everybody to sell. So the difference is, once you have legal regulated stores selling, there should be no need for people to buy on the illicit market. There won't be a demand that is filled by people that are selling or carrying small amounts. There is no arrest of people that are actually just in possession, because that's no longer a criminal offense. Selling, though, there should be no need for folks that have traditionally used the informal or the illegal sector to make a living to do that, because now there should be no demand for that. People are actually going to the legal stores. So criminalizing or penalizing that sector is actually not going to have the same consequences as it did when everything was illegal, right? Because now people can have access to the product in a legally regulated system. So you may actually want to have penalties that are fairly significant and stringent to keep, organized crime, or to keep people that are taking advantage of the system in check, because they're not the same people that were being targeted under the full legality program. So it's a nuanced argument, but that repressive regime should not exist in a legal regulated society, because people have access to the product.
And in terms of that question, I mean, just sort of one more on the time to market, was it I don't know if this is a good way to ask the question, but was it a market failure that all these illicit stores popped up in between the MRTA passing and, legal stores rolling out in a robust way? Would you view that as a market failure, or how do you consider that in terms of it being an intentional outcome versus not? I know it's sort of a philosophical question, but
no. It's a very economic one. No, it's a great question. It's definitely not intentional. So pop-ups. It's a couple of things. It's one, the price of having intentionally started with social equity rather than sort of allowing incumbent providers to come in. So we have to assume the responsibility for that, meaning there were a lot of registered organizations, MSOs, that were doing very good work, that had invested a lot of money in the state, that I know, that I worked with CEOs in those companies that were partners in growing the medical program, in lobbying and getting the adult use program over the line. So, they were ready to go, and we could have let them go way more quickly.
Right.
And I think they would have dampened the demand for these pop-ups. So one was our responsibility, but we really had a mandate from the legislature to make sure we started with equity. So that's one thing. Two, we were in a transition where the governor had just started. So this was the governor took over at the end of 2021. We were in 2022 and mobilizing all the state and city resources to really crack down fast and hard on the emerging illegal dispensaries. Was difficult to coordinate when there were so many other priorities of starting a new administration. I think that would have helped a lot, get it in fast, whack-a-mole it early so that it doesn't sort of keep sprouting up with impunity. So that's two. And then, the lawsuit didn't help, right? So we actually moved really quickly on giving the cards licenses. And two things slowed that down. One was DASNY took a lot longer and you've probably read all the press, and I'm not going to comment on that, but there was a fight between OCM and DASNY was insisting, we'll get the funding, we'll get the locations, hang on. And we were like, no, cut them loose, let the cards open their own locations, right? Because that was the big fight early on. We lost that fight. And so that slowed things down. And then the lawsuit slowed everything down. And I think the proof is in the pudding, Jeremy, because as of January of this year, we had 25 at most dispensaries.
Yeah.
And within 9 months, we have 200 more. So in 9 months, we got 200 new dispensaries launched. So I think, right, we now have that velocity in terms of opening. We have a huge pipeline of another 824 already issued, another 500 coming down over the next sort of 10 months. So I think the channel's stuffed. I think the openings are coming increasingly quickly, and they would have had we started a year earlier or 18 months. I think we would have significantly dampened the ability of these pop-ups to come up. I think that would have helped a lot. So a couple of different factors that contributed, some of them which were our responsibility, some of them which were beyond our control. But I think those were the contributing forces in that pop-up.
Do you, I mean, I'm just sort of curious on a personal perspective, like, do you get questions from regulators in states that are opening up their market now about how New York went about this, and what would you maybe do differently, or what are you advising them? I mean, there's some very big states who have very similar issues and frankly, similar politics to New York doing this at the moment, Minnesota being one of them. How do you advise them, right? Because you have a lot of experience and this is pretty new territory.
It really is. So I do actually, interesting enough, the most interesting part of my post OCM life has been getting calls from other countries more than other states, mainly because when we were I should know this off the top of my head, 15. I want to remember, I'm starting to lose some of, but we were number 15. And so we had relied, we actually created early on, when I was still in the governor's office, we created the National Association of Cannabis Regulators, CANRA, and it was led by, at the time, Colorado, Washington, Oregon, the OG regulators that are still, some of my closest sort of contacts that have also moved on. But we were all in the same. We relied so much on them. They really gave us a lot of that early information about how to structure markets, how to think of licensing. But other countries actually look to New York, interestingly, because they're a little, especially the Europeans and South Americans, they're a little taken back by just how rampantly commercial our U.S. markets are. They're concerned about the type of products that are being sold, the fact that they're all sold by private parties. They want to keep it European style and South American style a little more controlled. And so what they see in New York with the two-tier system, they see smaller farmers, they see smaller mom and pop dispensaries, and they're like, okay, we think this is a little bit closer to what we want to do, rather than the fully commercial, free-for-all in Oklahoma, or some of the larger verticals that are in other states. Florida, right? Florida, I mean, is dominated by a handful. They have over 60% of the market. There are companies that, like tobacco, in a sense, own the means of, of supply, and own 150 dispensaries. Like, very, very different market from New York. So I think they come to us for that advice. And so when I was at CANRA, I was heading up you won't be surprised, the Economics and Markets Committee, because that's what I love to do as an antitrust economist. And what I would say to new states at the time, and I say to new countries, is you just have to think very carefully about what we call the market architecture. So there are different ways to do this. You can have a two-tier system. You can limit the number of licenses that a particular person can own. You can have wholesale prices that are under, some review. You can have minimum resale prices as a retail, so you can have waivers and proximity protection. So there are a lot of different tools that are at your disposal. A lot of them we implemented in New York. I still think they're good. You look at our market now, Jeremy, I know it was considered a disaster 9 months ago. People were talking about it in a very pejorative sense, but that's because we were a year and a half, 2 years down the road, we had 25 dispensaries, not so much because of the way the market's structured, one thing I'll say, and I'm sorry for talking so long, but since I've been in the private sector, I've seen the evolution. I got out and people were like, well, New York's a bit of a mess. And within the last 9 months, and especially over the last 6, so many companies have approached me, especially from California, saying, love the way New York is growing sort of incrementally. Now it's at $1 billion, 220 stores. It looks like it'll go to another couple of billion. There are a limited number of cultivators that are, that I can see, processors I can trust. There aren't all these burner distros. This is actually kind of a rational market. Small, it's not being dominated. There aren't verticals that are paying to open up dispensaries. I get to sell I have brands that are small brands that are saying, I'm actually speaking to retail dispensaries and I don't have to pay to get on the shelf. I can actually approach them and tell them of my story. And they're like, I like your brand. I want to carry your brand. Why don't you partner up with a processor, do a white labeling agreement, and get to market as soon as possible? Those are success stories. So I've heard a very different tune over the last 6 months. And so part of the Bo report, coming back to that, Bo Whitney report we sort of worked on, is to say, okay, we're at a really critical juncture. We have $1 billion going through the system now. We have 222 dispensaries, over 800 in the pipeline. What's the game plan? Here's the data. Stakeholders, industry, legislatures, OCM, governor's office, everybody should be talking, using this data and saying, how do we want to do this? How do we turn these dials? How do we pull these levers? That's all I really want to encourage, is that kind of more transparent discussion about some of these policy ends. Because we're really sitting on a really, really great program right now.
Yeah. Well, here. I mean, I think I'm as bullish as ever.
Sorry, that was a little.
No. I agree. I am bullish on it, and I think despite the struggles, it's exciting every single day. Like people love buying the product. There's multiple legal dispensaries around me, so I fully hear on that. Axel, we are coming up on time, but I do have one fun question, fun in scare quotes, I guess, to end on. But thinking 10 years, 20 years down the line, right? If you have full federal legalization or something looking like that in the US, multiple European countries maybe with legal cannabis regimes, however that looks, what does the industry look like? Like, is it going to be something like coffee where you have craft scale at the bottom, not really much in the middle, and then the kind of Folgers and Starbucks at the top end? Is it going to be like beer? Like, how do you view this from a legal and economics perspective? Like, what will it look like in 20 years?
That is my favorite question, although one that, definitely deserves sort of a pint. Happy to do that and to pontificate on. But, we always used the alcohol tobacco analogy on this question. Coffee is an interesting one. The problem with coffee is that you really have a north-south divide where the producing countries really are, right? Where you can't grow coffee in the same way that you can grow weed here. And you, in fact, have some really interesting strains that grow in colder climate. I actually was lucky enough to visit northern India and find some strains growing by the side of the road. I just did a motorcycle trip there this summer, and we would just find these different varietals just growing everywhere. And we were at pretty high altitude with pretty cold weathers. And so it's really an incredible plant with a lot of versatility, as opposed to coffee requiring, a little bit more of a microclimate and a specialized grow zone. So, but between alcohol and tobacco, I think the way I would characterize it, the big framing I would say is on alcohol, you have a concentration in the supply tier, which I think we could really have in cannabis. And it's going to be very hard to control that. We're trying to control it in New York by not allowing stacking of licenses. But I think the roll up, the cost of production, the economies of scale are going to drive some form of supply concentration. You have states that can grow, New Mexico, Arizona, Texas, that could grow large quantities much more efficiently and cost effectively than we can. But I think, like alcohol, you're going to have niche brands, you're going to have craft brands that are really going to have a large market share because everybody wants to try new cannabis, and there's so many flavor profiles, terpenes, and cultivars. So in that way, I think it's going to resemble alcohol. In the distribution and retail, it could also resemble alcohol. We modeled that on that. That's an interesting opportunity, because then you have wine stores which have a large selection because of the two-tier, so they're not pushing a particular brand. They really carry diversity. And it gives small brands access, which I think is exciting opportunity. And that's what we based our New York model on. Tobacco, was originally a very fragmented grow scene. Actually, there were hundreds of tobacco farmers in the US in the early years until some smart capitalists rolled them all up into a couple of large producers. The problem with tobacco was actually on the distribution side. Cigarettes were available everywhere and ubiquitous. So they were in vending machines, they were just completely, so there was no economy built around retailing of tobacco. And there was just, I don't think, the same selection and the same interest. So I think we should guard against the tobacco model, and it's just not an interesting one for something as complex and as fun as cannabis. So I think it's just not a good fit. So I think we move more towards an alcohol model, and then the question becomes political. At the federal level, I do believe the push will be like in alcohol, let the states kind of have their own programs, and then every state is going to have to decide whether they want it to be rolled up or not. So Florida might decide to just have a couple of players because that's where they want to go. I think protecting supply is going to be hard because I think, you know, cross-border, cross-state is going to be forced upon us by the Commerce Clause. And then, but I do think in New York, for example, your distribution tier, everything has to run through a New York distributor. That's going to protect our retail space. I think New York's going to have a very vibrant retail space for the very, you know, for the long term. And I think we're going to be brand leaders that way. You know, we're going to have New York retailers that are promoting New York brands, and those will then be exported to other jurisdictions. So, you know, and then international trade's an interesting one. I mean, do we want Colombian strains? We probably do. That's a whole kind of other kettle of fish.
Axel, I look forward to continuing the conversation over a pint or otherwise, or right back here on Cultivated Live. Axel, thank you so much for joining us today. And
always a pleasure. Sorry for all the long-winded answers.
No, we appreciate it. We appreciate it. Thanks so much.
My pleasure. We'll talk soon, Jeremy. Be well.
Thank you.